can't require a doctor to use the service in order to invest. The one case that I mentioned from 1995 was a case where it had to do with a laboratory, and it was physician investment in the laboratory. And the people who put together the investment told the people who were promoting it for them, no tying of investment to using the lab. And this one person went out and did. And she said that what she said was, you know, only doctors who say they're going to use it can be in, and if a doctor doesn't use it, we're going to throw them out. In the end, when they finally got through, the whole process, the only person who was convicted was the person who had not listened to the company and had told people that if they were, that you needed to use it to be in, and we would throw people out if they didn't. She was the only one in the end that was convicted, had any penalties. So, one moral of the story is you can be out there on your own. No tying things in. Remember, United is looking to do everything proper. If somebody goes out on their own and decides to do things differently because they think they got a better idea, and who's ever going to know? You're going to be out there by yourself. And it's not pretty. That's what we talked about. Okay, if you have a new company that's formed, I don't know that you're doing that, but if a new company was formed, you have to you have to get enough money from the doctors to sufficiently capitalize it. One of the things that came up with the OIG on the prostate companies was the pro formas. They looked at the pro formas that were given out, and they looked at how much the doctors were putting in and how much was being promised, and they said that one comment was, even Bernie Madoff didn't promise returns like this. Okay, there is a disclosure program. You already have a hotline. It's going to continue. You can report with your name or you can report anonymously. Just report. However, you can do it anonymously, but there are problems with reporting anonymously because it's harder to investigate an anonymous complaint because often you need more information. So if you're going to do it anonymously, you give as much information as you can. If you get more information, then call back in anonymously. I was the one who called about such and such, and here's some more information. If you do not do it anonymously, United will use all reasonable means to keep it quiet, not to tell. Sometimes I will tell you, though, people will find out because it starts to get investigated. The only person who could have possibly been was Jane. But they will do it. But most important, nobody will be retaliated against for reporting anything. There will be no retribution. And if somebody tries to retaliate against you, call Julie, because it will not be tolerated. So if you report that your supervisor did such and such, and then the supervisor figures out it was you, and they try to say bad things about you, or they do who knows what, they give you a bad schedule, whatever, call Julie. That will not be tolerated. Oops. Okay, you can email Julie if you want. That's okay. Oops. Okay, again, no retribution. We want to hear about the problems. Again, as I said before, most things can be fixed. Okay, you got lots of options on how to report. Okay, we've done with the code of conduct. There are other things in the code of conduct. It's long. I only picked out some things. If you have any questions about them, call Julie, ask her. Poor Julie's going to have the biggest mailbox. Okay, let's talk about exclusions. I mentioned it before. What happens if you employ somebody who's excluded? It's a violation of law. What could happen? Well, you might have to refund all the money that the government you got from the company got from the government that person worked on, or more. The government, sometimes the government takes less, but they have the ability to take back all the money that relates relates to that person's involvement. So if you had an excluded tech, they could take away all the money that came from the service that that tech provided. Besides, they could fine you and do all kinds of other things for employing a person. Now, also it's what's called a reportable event. It's one of the things that will have to be reported to the OIG if it happens. Okay, so if you find, and it can happen, and I'll tell you a story about something about in a moment. If you find that there was a mistake and somebody was hired who is excluded, call Julie immediately. Okay, so what happens is the government is requiring, and you were doing this anyway, you have to screen for people who are excluded. This was something you were doing anyway. And you have to, so what's somebody who's ineligible? It's somebody who is excluded from participation, called debarred, excluded from participation in federal health care programs, or is on the GSA, the Government General Services Administration list of excluded parties. That usually comes, that's a government contracting thing, so it might come from a vendor that you might use who might be excluded. Or somebody who is convicted of a criminal offense where there's mandatory exclusion. If you're convicted of a felony health care offense like a kickback or START, then you, not START, that's a little bit, a kickback, for example, they must exclude you. A couple years ago, we represented a pharmacy in the Midwest where the pharmacy where one of the owners of the pharmacy had been excluded. Not just had been convicted. He plea bargained to one thing, and they were told, supposedly told them that he wouldn't be excluded. They can't make that bargain, because if there's a felony conviction or a felony plea, there's required exclusion. So, what happens is the company checks the exclusion lists. Their databases, they're easy to check, and they check everybody against it. It's really important to get maiden names and aliases, and any name that anyone ever used in their life, you need. I had a client who had two client exclusion things. The first one was a company that hired a nurse. She was hired in August, and they checked the exclusion list, and it was clean. She wasn't there. And then they did a routine recheck in January, and they found she had been excluded in November. Luckily, the reason she'd been excluded was she had lost her license in Texas for, I think, drug use or something like that. But because the nursing boards don't talk to each other very well, she had not luckily lost her license in Ohio where she was providing the service. So at least they weren't providing services by an unlicensed nurse. That would have been a real disaster. So we reported to the OIG. We said, and they had checked it, and they had copies, which I tell everybody, they had copies of their checks. When you check it, you can print out a paper, and on it says the day you checked it. And it was sitting in the file. So we sent to the OIG what happened. We explained how they checked, and then they rechecked, they found it, and what happened. And this must have happened 9 years ago. The government never tells you, never sends you a letter saying we're not doing anything. But when I called, they said, there was well, the most that would happen is we dock you her salary, but let's see what happens. I talked to the investigator later on who said, these things happen all the time. They had checked, and they had proof. And 9 years later, we have never heard another thing. So I'm assuming that they realized that they checked, they rechecked, it happened in the middle, didn't expect you to check every day, and that was it. Another example that happened was another company that had checked the exclusion list, and they checked it against it was a married woman, they checked it against her current name. On her application, she had written her maiden name. They asked for all your previous names, it was on there. But they only checked the married name. Then later they found out she had been excluded for failure to pay her student loans. And that is one of the few ways that you actually it doesn't have a mandatory time. They'll let you back in once you pay the loans. So she had been excluded for the loans. We reported it and said they had checked it. The person at the company had neglected, had done it herself. She had not called us. She did file it on her own, the in-house lawyer. And she hadn't done a very good check of the files, because she wrote to the OIG that they had no way to know that she had this other name. It turned out when the OIG requested all the files, right there on the application for her job was her other name. did the OIG, the person at the OIG was livid because she said to me, I went to see her, I could not get them to get off this. She said, because not only had they not checked all the names, but she said they lied to us. They said they had no way to check, and it was sitting in the file. And they paid. They were lucky. I think but I think they had to pay back all of her salary. It could have been a lot worse. They could have. It was a nursing home. They could have made her pay back everything in the nursing home that the nursing home had gotten. So that's the lesson. Check, keep a record, and check every single name. And also, at that time, it may have changed, but at that time, Social Security number. While they asked the Social Security number at that time, the Social Security was only used to differentiate. So if they found two John Smiths, they would use the Social Security number to differentiate. But it didn't do a Social Security check. It only checked by names. Okay. All right, every arrangement, now remember focus arrangements, every arrangement with a hospital should have a written contract. One of the things that came up in the with the OIG, although they didn't press it a lot, I think because they had what they thought was enough, was that there were what were called oral agreements, oral contracts. Oral agreements are as good as the paper they're written on. It is a stark violation not to have a written agreement. Not only that, the government is requiring written agreements for every what's called a focus arrangement. Remember, that's lithotripsy in those 3 states. But it's a violation of Stark anywhere. So for a lithotripsy contract. So you really can't limit it to those 3 states. So you must, and with everything else, get a written agreement. Where there will be if you want to do a trial, there will be a short-term agreement. Generally, the contract should be for at least a year. But if there is a trial, we can do a short-term agreement. The hospital may not want to do a long-term agreement, so you might do a short-term agreement. But don't change the price, the compensation. Don't change anything that's in the short-term agreement. So if you agree to trial, get your price set. You know, we'll see it right out. But if you take us, this is what the price is going to be. Everyone, it's important to have, it's no good to have a written agreement if everybody didn't sign it. So you got to check and be sure that you have all the signatures. Don't provide a service unless there's a written contract. We're going to have to work something out where the schedulers can know that the hospital has, the schedulers will be able to check and be sure that there is a written contract before they can schedule. And I have a company that found one that way. The scheduler figured it out, that there was no written contract. Schedulers are the last hope on that. Every contract has to have a certification that's written up there, that the parties to the agreement will not violate the anti-kickback statute or Stark. It'll be worded slightly differently, but that's what they have to do. And there will be a requirement that all of your records are kept and that the government can see the records. Okay, there will be procedures in place to record all of these arrangements. There will be a computer program where a database where every single contract will be entered. It's what we call the focus arrangements tracking system. And what's required by the CIA is to have a system for all existing, new, and renewed focus arrangements. Okay. All right. The director of provider. I don't remember if I have the title. Is it director of provider contracting? All right. So director of provider contracting.
Or you could say
where is he, Jim? Is responsible for that. To be sure everything is entered in the database. He doesn't have to do it himself. He can get somebody else to do it, but he's got to be sure it's done. Okay? If I am going to be the most unpopular person in this place. I wanted to come with a Kevlar vest, but don't throw tomatoes. If there are any payments on the contract other than the contract price, that has to be entered into the system. Otherwise, there's no need. We got the government to agree that you don't have to write in every time what you got. They originally wanted you to track all the amounts, and I said, wait, this is ridiculous. There is a requirement that regulatory council, which right now is us, review every single arrangement. So we will look at every single contract to make it easier